Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have Greg Potter back on, and we are doing our second episode here for supplements. We did episode all about supplements part 1, episode 279, if you want to check that. And before we dive into the supplements, I just wanted to do a quick little update. Greg, so first, Greg, thank you for coming back on here and doing the part 2 of this episode. And yeah, just give a little update on how you've been and things going on. I know that you're traveling abroad and you have a nice little podcast coming out too. So maybe hit on those two things.
Yeah, so I was saying to you before you hit record that I'm in Montenegro and in a place named Kotor, that's what the locals say, or Kotor, Kotor. And it's a beautiful little bay that basically eventually winds its way out to the Adriatic Sea. Been here for 3 weeks now, got another week left. So just working remotely, but enjoying the views when not working. And fortunately, I've got a good little gym around the corner. Although right now it's a public holiday, which is the third consecutive day of the public holidays. And so our diet is pretty strange because all of the shops are closed and I'm basically left with sardines, vegetables and olive oil. So I'm effectively on a ketogenic diet, but my hand's been forced. And then you mentioned the podcast there, and I haven't released any episodes yet, although by the time this episode comes out, I think it probably will be live. But I'm launching my own podcast named Reason and Wellbeing that's going to focus primarily on how to be healthy and perform well at whatever's most important to you across the lifespan. But ultimately, the podcast will get into some other subjects too, just related to helping people make good decisions and thinking through some important topics that are meaningful and topical and could have significant long-term consequences down the line. So check that out on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you tune in from. I think that's the only other thing that's new is I am now officially working with the London Psychiatry Clinic, which is a psychiatry clinic that's based in London, true to its name. And I'm helping them with some health coaching work and also helping people who have sleep issues too. So looking forward to doing some more work with them. Great group of people. I think they also have plans to produce a lot of helpful online content over time as well. I know there are several people working on that. So I think it will ultimately be a really helpful resource for people.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's really cool. Doing that and then also the podcast and then also traveling abroad. So a lot has actually gone on in just that little short amount of time. I love it. With the podcast, we talked about this before we hit record. Are you going to, I know you said you're going to do it by yourself. Are you going to do any interviews or anything like that? Or are you just going to look at data and stuff? Or yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's mostly going to be interviews. And as Jeff, I think podcasting is a great way to meet interesting people.
Yeah.
And also to better understand how to communicate important ideas. I think the process of teaching other people about things is actually such a good thing to do, both for yourself and for others too, potentially, if you can convey helpful information. So it's a way of helping others, but also something that I will enjoy myself. And I've been either a guest on podcasts or I've hosted a couple of podcasts very briefly, just stepping in for the show host a couple of times for about the last 6 years or so. And so hopefully I'm going to take some of that experience and use what I've learned to produce something that is really enjoyable for people. But time will tell. But yes, mostly interviews with other people. I'll occasionally do solo episodes, which will be me filling in gaps. Because there are often subjects that you don't get to discuss with the guests that you've had on, and you want to try and add those pieces in so that the listener has a more complete picture of what's going on. I might eventually also do some Q&A, and I might do some solo episodes that focus on specific subjects that I find particularly interesting at the moment. But for the most part, it'll be me interviewing other people, primarily scientists and professors, but also people such as entrepreneurs. And one of the first episodes is with a guy who was a professor of behavioral science, but he's now a screenwriter and he's a friend of mine. And the first film that he ever wrote won loads of BAFTAs this year and multiple Oscars as well. So it'll give you an idea of just how it's not just going to be me speaking with people about sleep or nutrition or exercise, and it will cover a range of subjects with people that I think others have lots to learn from.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so keeping a wide variety there. And I agree with you too. The podcasting's been awesome because I am able to connect people that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to. It is super cool to be able to do that. And you definitely build relationships with people if you have them on a couple times and you get to know them on a different level rather than just like exchanging emails or messages on Instagram. So that's been one of the like cool with podcasting is building those relationships. Awesome. Looking forward to the podcast coming out, and we'll definitely have to take a look. And I know you'll have a ton of super smart people on there. And then last thing before we move on. So traveling abroad, do you do that often? And is there any other, has your diet had to change or anything like that going to where you're at now? And
yeah, travel quite a lot, and I just love it. And I know that's a cliche thing to say and that most people love traveling, but I've always yearned for that. And I find that desire almost insatiable to get away and see the world while I can. And I also think a bit of anxiety related to things such as the climate and the fact that the natural world, for the most part, unfortunately, isn't getting any better. And so I feel a kind of time pressure to get out and see it while I can. So I take many opportunities to travel. It has its pros and cons, obviously. It can interfere with work, all the moving around, and it also means that when you're not in any one place for more than 6 months or so, you don't build a community, and you have your friends and family back at home, but you don't see them every week or every other week or every month. And instead it's in fits and spurts. So there are big upsides and big downsides, but yeah, I've traveled a lot. And in the last few years, that's mostly been within Europe. But if I think just back over the last 8 months or so, to places such as Indonesia for a month, Egypt, Montenegro, and a couple of other places too. So fortunately, I have work that I can take with me, and I really just need a laptop. And now I'll need a microphone and some earphones. But I really enjoy that process. And in terms of how it affects nutrition and exercise and things, it really depends on the country. So here in Montenegro, for instance, I've got a good gym around the corner from me. It's got a glute ham raise, which I'm really impressed by. There aren't many gyms back in England that have ham raises. But in some places, if I think of Sumatra, for example, gyms are few and far between. And so if I go away, I will just make do. And sometimes actually, when I do go away, I won't really do any full exercise. I'm always really active. I think that runs in my family, actually. If I look at my dad, for instance, he's constantly on his feet, as is my mum. But sometimes if you've been training hard for a period of time, you actually need a break. And for the most part, when I go away to places such as that, I might go 3 or so without stepping foot in a gym. But by the end of those 3 weeks, I feel relatively fresh. I've often lost loads of weight just because I am so active. And one of the issues when you go to places such as Indonesia is that you end up with food poisoning, or you're always bouncing around and you don't really prioritize eating. And I'm tall, I'm 6 foot. I also am naturally relatively lean, and so weight just falls off me if I don't pay close attention to what I'm eating. But it's really enjoyable trying different cuisines. And within Europe, I eat pretty similarly to how I do back at home. If anything, just try and make sure that I consume plenty of local produce and try local dishes and things. But here in Montenegro, it's pretty similar to somewhere such as Italy, to be honest. There are lots of tomatoes, aubergines, nuts. It's relatively typical Mediterranean fare. Eating well is a non-issue.
Awesome. Yeah, that would probably be the cool thing there with traveling, is being able to try different cuisines and stuff like that. But also, like you said, in certain places you go to, it's like you might have trouble getting food, like you said, in Indonesia and stuff like that, which is always going to add an interesting variable to the equation. But yeah, I always like to ask people that, travel abroad for a long time. I know I've had Menno Henselmans on multiple times, and he likes to do that as well too, where he's just at different places throughout the year. And I just think it's pretty cool to hear about that and your experiences with it. But like you said, comes with pros and cons, just like anything. Awesome. Cool, Greg. It sounds like everything's going great on your end. So let's get into the topic today. So we did, like I mentioned earlier, we did part 1 of our supplement episode, all about supplements, and that was episode 279 for anybody who wants to go back and listen to the first half. And we talked about basically, what to look for as a smart consumer with supplements, mistakes people make with supplements, paying attention to dosages. We talked about fish oil, vitamin D, magnesium, ashwagandha, and melatonin. So I wanted to continue that, and we had a few others we wanted to go over. So I'm going to start with kind of the theme of health supplements to start here. And the one that I feel like comes up is iron as well. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on iron. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you and we'll go from there.
Okay. So starting with iron, I think it's something a lot of people need to pay attention to, but for very different reasons. So if I take myself, for instance, very self-indulgent, then I'm an omnivore. I eat a varied diet. I eat quite a lot of meat and fish relative to other people. And I'm a man, so I don't lose blood on a regular basis. And so for me, I would actually accumulate iron over time, and excess iron can lead to lots of oxidative stress and is implicated in various different pathophysiological processes that relate to aging. And so in that instance, it would make sense for somebody to occasionally give blood and thereby reduce their bodily stores of iron. And so that's one of the things that I try and do frequently. And interestingly, there are lots of health benefits that associate with that. And some of those are probably mediated by reductions in bodily iron store. But those include things such as reduced risk of various different cardiovascular diseases. And interestingly, if you look at rates of those diseases in men versus women, the difference is larger during the time in which women have their reproductive cycle, because they are regularly losing blood. And then by around the age of 50 or so, around the menopause, that difference between men and women is no longer nearly so large. And there are also interesting data showing that giving blood can help offload various different toxic chemicals that are otherwise incredibly hard to get off. It can acutely reduce blood pressure, improve cardiometabolic health, such as measures of glycemic control and insulin resistance too. So suffice to say that if you are an omnivore and you're giving blood regularly, you probably benefit from doing so. And for people such as myself, we don't need to worry about iron. However, quite a few people do. I think foremost among those individuals are vegans, and especially vegans who do high volumes of exercise. We know, for instance, that relative energy deficiency or relative energy deficiency in sport, if we're speaking about it in that context, can lead to quite low iron stores. And if somebody is doing high volumes of exercise and they're vegan, which is going to potentially reduce their iron intake, but also interfere with the actual absorption of iron, then that's a double whammy for bodily iron status. And that could end up leading to anemia, because iron is obviously needed to make hemoglobin. Hemoglobin then shuttles oxygen into tissues, and it's therefore really important to energy production. And if you can't do that effectively, then you're going to be tired and have the characteristic symptoms of anemia. So in the context of vegans, there are a couple of things to consider. So first, the iron that's present in plants, such as green leafy vegetables, is non-heme iron, and it's not as bioavailable as the kind of iron that you get in animal foods. Not only that, but there are compounds in plants such as tannins, which you get in, say, tea, that can interfere with iron uptake, and phytates in grains and pulses. But there are also things that will improve iron absorption, which include vitamin C. So I think for vegans, it makes sense to prioritize consuming iron-rich foods, and ideally do so while avoiding foods that could interfere with iron absorption and consuming vitamin C containing foods. So for example, if you consume an orange with a meal that contains these iron-rich foods, then that might be a smart thing to do to increase your bodily stores. You can supplement iron, and sometimes, of course, that's indicated. Not only in anemia, but there are actually some interesting conditions in which that there isn't enough iron in certain bodily tissues. So for example, there's a sleep disorder named restless leg syndrome that's characterized by insufficient iron in certain parts of the brain, especially dopaminergic brain circuit. And those people increase their brain iron stores by, say, having iron injections. Their sleep problems, which is basically a variety of different movements while in bed and a kind of creepy, crawly feeling that tends to ripple across the surface of the skin, especially in the legs, their sleep problems will subside and can go into remission entirely. But I think that for those people, they should be taking iron supplementation and medical supervision. And if you've got a history of anemia and you've had blood work done on a semi-regular basis, and you have some idea about where your ferritin stores typically are and iron supplementation effective, then I think supplementing iron on a regular basis might be a smart thing to do. It's more likely to be needed in females than it is in males, and their iron needs in general are slightly higher than men because they lose blood on a regular basis if they're of reproductive age. So a very long-winded way of saying that women who have their menstrual cycles intact, who are doing high volumes of exercise and who consume lots of plants and little or no animal foods, are probably the ones who might want to consider iron supplementation. And then in terms of forms of iron supplementation, like I said, sometimes injections are indicated, but one of the issues with iron is just that it can cause some gastrointestinal distress in people, can also constipate some people quite a lot. there are different forms of iron. It can be chelated with various different agents, but I think iron glycinate and bisglycinate supplements are generally a good choice. There is a bit of research suggesting that they might be slightly easier on the gastrointestinal system. So I'd probably start there if you fall into that category that I just described. I'll pause there, Jeff.
Yeah. Again, it sounds like we'll push people towards eating more iron-rich foods. Again, it's at some point, certain people are going to be at higher risk. And then there's the absorption issue, like you talked about, especially with, is it not non-heme iron with like vegetables and stuff like that? Yeah. That you look out for. So what would be some signs then? Would you go, if you didn't have blood work or anything like that, would you still have somebody supplement, or is that something that it does come with some risk or anything like that?
No, I probably wouldn't. However, if you're a vegan, then I would maybe consider it depending on the types of foods that you like. So if you're a vegan and you also discovered that there are lots of iron-rich plants that you don't actually like and you don't consume many of, and you're prone to, say, fatigue, then iron supplementation, I think, is probably something you can do without too much cause for concern. But because iron can accumulate in the body, and when it does so, it can pose problems, I think it's best done under medical supervision. So the other thing to contemplate is that many people will just take a multivitamin that contains iron anyway. And so you might well be taking it without even realizing that you are taking it if you're currently consuming a multivitamin or multi-mineral supplement that contains iron. I don't know if that's helpful. The idea to get blood work done. Otherwise, if you're a vegan and you don't like many iron-rich foods, then you probably could supplement a low dose by default. And then otherwise, I generally wouldn't recommend supplementing it unless you have restless leg syndrome. And that is something that you might want to look into. There's plenty of information about it online. But if you find yourself feeling like you need to move your legs a lot around the sleep period, typically comes on shortly before sleep, and you might have that tingling sensation I described, then you might be somebody that has that. And then restoring your iron levels could basically get rid of that problem entirely.
Awesome. Yeah. And so I guess maybe hit on what would be, again, you said people that are at higher risk of it, but what would be some like signs and symptoms that you also are low in iron? And then maybe even and go into what would be signs that you have too much iron?
Yeah, too much iron. There probably aren't many obvious signs, and really you would need to get blood work done in order to find out that is the case for you. And then too little iron, it would be classic anemic symptoms. And if you find yourself very easily fatigued, so say that you're just walking uphill and previously it was a non-issue for you, but nowadays you get winded and you have to stop on the way, that kind of thing indicates that you might well have that particular problem.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's one of those things where, because I feel like people who are just generally out of shape probably need that as well. So that's where you're going to combine that with, like, if you have the sign, but also if you can get your blood work done too, just to double check it there with that.
Yeah, I think it also depends on someone's personal history. So if you're slim and you're physically active and doing activities such as walking up the hill, carrying shopping, never used to pose a problem for you, but now without obvious other reasons, those activities are much more strenuous than they used to be. That, I think, is quite a strong indication that there might be something going on related to anemia.
Yeah. In iron, do you think this is, again, you mentioned the people that would be at highest risk. Do you think it is more common that people are low in iron than like what people think, or is this not as big of a deal as?
It's not the most common mineral insufficiency in countries such as the US. I mentioned, I think, the previous magnesium is, but I do think there are certain populations in which it is really common. And there are going to be quite large differences between people in their needs. And so if you think about females, for example, one of the difficulties is that their overall energy needs are substantially lower than men's on average, yet they need more iron. And also, if you think about iron-rich foods, so take the instance of something like red meat, it might well be that men consume all those foods on average too. And so I just think that there are certain people who need to be much more particular about trying to consume enough in their diets. But yeah, next time you get your blood work done, just make sure that you've got some iron relevant markers in there, such as ferritin, and then take it from there. And then if you're experiencing that kind of unexplained fatigue, then definitely look into that. And then in terms of iron overload, there are conditions that can result from that. So things like hemochromatosis, but those are quite rare. And I'll just add that if you do have one of those, then donating blood can dramatically improve your health. And so I think actually people who are tuning in, the mere act of going to give blood can be helpful because you'll find out approximately current iron levels are. And so if you can't get a blood test done, but you can give blood, then go and try and give blood. And if your levels are high enough, or even higher than you like them to be, then you end up giving blood and bring them back into a healthier range, which also would be really good for somebody else. And then if they're not high enough, then you can look into that issue further.
And so if it wasn't high enough, would they be like, hey, you can't give blood, or
yeah. I don't know what the cutoffs are in the US, but yeah, in the UK, you just won't be able to give. And then if they're below a certain threshold, you won't be able to give for about a year. And then if that occurs on a regular basis, they will say you can't ever give blood again. So it depends, depending on which country you're in, but there are checks and balances built into the whole process.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's a cool way. That's a nice way to do it without having to get your blood work done. If you don't want to do that, probably want to push people to get blood work done every once in a while. But if you can't do it, like going and giving, but that can be a good way to iron levels are at. Cool. Is there anything else on iron that you want to mention before we go into the next supplements?
No, I don't think so.
Cool. All right. So that was my side of the health, quote unquote, health supplements. So I didn't know, I wanted to leave this to you if there was any that we potentially missed or that you think are interesting from like what you would call like a health kind of supplement, overall health.
Yeah, there are actually loads.
Let's go.
So I'll not try and go into any real depth, but I'll just mention some of them. Obviously, this depends on somebody's dietary pattern. And the more restrictive your diet is, the more that you need to consider where you should supplement with, say, vitamins and minerals. In the case of vegans, for instance, I do think that there are several micronutrients that might be helpful to supplement. Ideally, this would be based on tests, but those include B12, and I would actually probably put that near the top of the list for vegans, if not at the top. And just the methylated B12 supplement, so methylcobalamin, I think is a really good way to go. And the reason, of course, is that many plants don't contain much, if any, vitamin B12. And that's a problem because it's really important to the function of your nervous system and also to regulation of bodily homocysteine levels, which are very relevant to things like cardiovascular disease. So if you found out, for example, that your homocysteine is very high, it might well just reflect the fact that you're not consuming enough B12. And one option, apart from trying to supplement with vitamin B12, is for vegans to add in bivalves, so things like mussels and oysters, which would probably deter some, but I just mentioned that because some people believe that they aren't sentient. They don't feel things like pain the way that we do, and they're also incredibly nutrient dense. They're very rich in things like zinc too, which is another common nutrient insufficiency among vegans. So bivalve veganism, which has been coined, can be a really smart eye for a lot of people. And that brings us to zinc. So zinc is obviously important for many different processes, everything from immune function to protein metabolism. Again, lots of vegans don't get enough of it, particularly given that they probably need to consume something like 50% more zinc than omnivores, due to the fact that it's just not very well absorbed from plant foods. And there are some plant foods that are quite rich in zinc, so things like pumpkin seeds, but they often need preparation in order to make the zinc more available. So things like soaking and fermenting those foods can help with that potentially. But suffice it to say that sometimes zinc supplementation is a good idea for those people. The other one that comes to mind is iodine. D3 and K2 I'd put in that category too, but I know that we discussed both in the last podcast. And the tricky thing about iodine is that obviously it's really important for thyroid function, but hypothyroidism, which is quite common, especially among women, many women at least, will at some point experience hypothyroidism. And in women, it's typically driven by some sort of autoimmune condition, whether that's Graves or Hashimoto's. But the tricky thing with iodine is just that hypothyroidism can be caused by either too little or too much iodine. And so there's a bit of investigative work that probably needs to be done in order to work out what's going on there. The other thing with iodine and people consuming a plant-based diet is that there are some vegetables in particular that are quite rich in nitrogens that can basically impair your body's ability to use iron. And those include things like brassicas, so broccoli, cauliflower, sprouts, that type of thing. And just cooking those vegetables, making sure that you're not consuming raw broccoli and cauliflower and so on, if your iodine intake is lower than it should be, is a good first port of call. But otherwise, I think using iodized table salt as opposed to supplementing with iodine is probably enough for those people. So I'd probably leave it there for the vegans, but just add that I do think the vegans are particularly likely to benefit from creatine monohydrate supplementation. just given that their dietary intakes tend to be much lower than people who consume animal foods too, because the richest sources of creatine include things like sardines, red meat, so on. And then in terms of other supplements for health, there are, of course, thousands of these, and it really depends on what somebody is trying to target. And I suppose that you could classify them in different ways. So take the example of someone who's traveling. So going back to what we were discussing at the start, in that instance, I think you could take something like a multivitamin, multimineral, and you also take a dietary fiber supplement or a prebiotic, just because when some people go traveling, they don't consume as much fiber as they do back at home. And for some people, that will cause constipation. So taking a multivitamin, multimineral with you, as well as something like inulin, or you could take flax seeds with you, or linseeds, we say over here, isn't a bad idea at all. And that might just stop you getting blocked up and make sure that you're not way under your needs of any one particular nutrient. And in some parts of the world, you might well be prone to that because diets are much more restrictive than they are in countries such as the US or the UK. And then the other category that we might consider is supplements that you're taking to target a particular health or performance outcome. And of course, there are many of these. I'll just think about in terms of what I'm guessing are the demographics of the listeners. But let's say that those people are interested in particular in resistance training and building a strong, attractive physique. Obviously, in terms of replacing foods and things, you could take a protein powder. It goes without saying, and there are lots of good ones out there. And historically, lots of the research is focused on whey for good reasons. And since then, obviously, more of us looked at things like casein, and now many plant-based protein powders too. So I won't go into those, but they can be really helpful where you haven't got access to good, complete protein source. In terms of other protein powders, lots of people are interested in collagen nowadays. And I think there was a tendency for many of us to eschew collagen initially. I certainly did, because to me, collagen was always an incomplete protein, and it didn't have enough of the essential amino acids to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And so I thought gelatin, collagen, no thanks. That's not going to help with anything. But actually, the research that's been done over the last decade or so is really interesting. And a couple of different broad categories of collagen products. So you can either take collagen as a powdered supplement, and that's typically either type 1 and 3 collagen, which comes from the skin for the most part, but it's also present in things like blood vessels. And then type 2 collagen, which is what you find in cartilage. And typically, if you buy a collagen powder, it will be one of those two, although sometimes you'll find ones that are combined. The other type of collagen product that you might come across is called U2, which is a particular type of collagen. It's an undenatured collagen that's taken from the chicken sternum, of all places, and it acts in quite a different way. So whereas type 2 collagen and type 1 and 3 collagen provide building blocks for the synthesis of collagen-containing tissues, such as tendons and ligaments, to this undenatured chicken sternum collagen I mentioned, seems to instead act by regulating the immune system in certain tissues, and specifically inflammatory T-cell responses and reg cell regulation, such that people who have cartilage damage and ongoing inflammation of the cartilage you might see in something like rheumatoid arthritis are likely to stand to benefit from U2 supplementation specifically. And there are several studies showing that taking about 40 milligrams of U2, so we're talking about a vanishingly small dose, can help with some of those conditions. And then otherwise, if you're interested in collagen for its other uses, and those include, like I mentioned, tendon remodeling, connective tissue remodeling in general. So there's actually quite a lot of research showing that supplementing collagen is good for skin health. It reduces wrinkling, improves skin hydration. And there was a meta-analysis of this research not too long ago showing favorable results. I think for people who are interested in some of those other uses, they can take probably anywhere from about 5 to 15 grams of collagen powder, and ideally take that with a vitamin C containing food. To my knowledge, there hasn't actually been a study that's compared taking isolated collagen powder to collagen plus vitamin C and looking at whether there's a difference in outcomes. But the rationale for combining them makes sense, basically because vitamin C helps with the synthesis of collagen. So there are several enzymes that are involved in that process that require vitamin C to act as quick as possible. So you could, for example, just have a vitamin C containing fruit at the same time as taking this collagen protein powder, or you could add something like 50 milligrams of vitamin C if you want, or you could take a product that contains both. You probably don't need to spend a fortune on some of these fancier collagen products. Literally just taking a bovine or a fish collagen protein powder, which is just plain not undenatured, it's just plain collagen powder, and adding that to things like breakfast. So let's say that you eat oats in the morning, you can just stir it into that, is fine. It's all more or less tasteless. It doesn't have a strong taste at all. So you can add it to various different drinks and things. It's also very soluble. So it's very versatile, and it's an easy addition to various different meals that you might consume. So I think there's enough research now to actually recommend that for lots of people, whether you're interested in warding off skin aging or you're interested in improving your adaptations to exercise. And there is work both showing that taking powdered collagen products can improve musculoskeletal function. So things like rate of torque product in various different exercises. So think of something like a knee extension. But interestingly, there is actually a little bit of work suggesting that it can support muscle hypertrophy too, which I was surprised by. But there's been some work by some scientists from the UK showing that in the last couple of years. And if you don't take a powder, I would just say eat the skin of meat and fish as well. And for some people, that's repulsive. But for those of us who it's not repulsive for, I think just making sure that if you eat chicken, say that you eat the skin as well, and then you're going to get some collagen from that. And then in terms of other joint supplements, connective tissue supplements.
Real quick, Greg, can I ask just a couple of follow-up questions on collagen? So with collagen, my understanding too is that, and like you mentioned, the skin is where you're going to get it from. So a lot of times, most people aren't going to get that type of protein in their diet, right? So that's where you could potentially look at supplementing with collagen, because people aren't going to eat the skin, things like that. And then if let's say you do take that type of protein, and you mentioned that it can help with muscle hypertrophy, would that be something where it's like, if somebody has a good amount of that in their diet, would you still have them try to get other amino acids and focus on that too?
Yeah. So regarding the person who's trying to improve how they adapt to, say, resistance training, I think like you mentioned, they don't consume much skin or any of those things. And if they've got some sort of existing joint problem, say, I would probably quite strongly recommend taking supplemental collagen. What we don't really know is how it acts when combined with other proteins. There's also not much work on timing. Some studies have had people take it before exercise. Some people take it after exercise. I don't think it matters really. I think the most important thing is take that daily dose. And I think 10 grams a day is a really good place to start. And as you alluded to, it's likely to be most beneficial for people who don't consume much collagen from their existing diets. And the reason that taking collagen is helpful is it's rich in certain amino acids that aren't present in high amounts in other foods. One of them, for example, hydroxyproline, is literally not in plants. And so if you want to get the benefits of collagen supplementation right now, you have to take collagen. I know there are some people working on some vegan alternatives to collagen. I don't know if those are available yet, but it will benefit people most who just don't consume much collagen in their diet. Another source of these amino acids, so hydroxyproline, proline, and glycine, is gelatin. And frankly, I think that gelatin and collagen powders are probably pretty much interchangeable as long as the total quantity of amino acids is equivalent. And when I say quantity of amino acids, I just mean quantity of protein, because the amino acid profiles are practically the same. And you can look at amino acid profiles from manufacturers if you like. I bought a collagen supplement not long ago, and it doesn't list the amino acids on the back of it. It also doesn't list the source. So I just got in touch with the manufacturer and said, what type of collagen is this? And do you have an amino acid profile for it? And they sent me both through about 3 hours later. So if you want to go to that level of detail, then that's something that you can do as well. And then in terms of other question, I'm just racking my brain for what it was.
Yeah. So I just asked, would that be something, a lot of times people ask, hey, can collagen count like towards my protein intake for the day, or should I add a little bit more protein, or yeah?
Yeah, I don't think people need to worry about that for the most part. You would if, let's say, you were trying to hit 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day in order to support muscle hypertrophy. Imagine a situation in which half of that, so 0.8 grams per kilo, is coming from collagen, and then half of it is coming from wheat protein. You've got two pretty poor quality protein sources. In that instance, it would matter that so much of it is coming from collagen. But in someone who eats anything like a normal diet, especially if it's a mixed diet, I think it's a non-issue. And when we're talking about, say, 10 grams a day, which I think will probably give you most of the benefits that collagen can yield, it's such a small quantity of protein. It's not really displacing other proteins in the diet. And you'll probably find that if you add collagen into your diet, you actually just bump up your protein intake by roughly the amount of collagen that you added to it. So I wouldn't really use it as a replacement for other proteins within a meal. bear in mind that I'm only recommending that you take about 10 grams anyway. I'll just add that to the meal as opposed to displacing other protein sources.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's basically the amount that you're saying that is going to be beneficial isn't going to add a ton of protein anyway. So you'll still need to just make sure that you hit your protein in other sources. And again, just making sure that you're not getting so much, like you said, from like wheat protein and then collagen, like making sure you are getting good quality sources of protein in there too. I know you're a go-to like other joint supplements.
Yeah, I'll just quick brush over these, but of the different ones that have been studied, I think a couple can be helpful. And I don't think they even need to be taken as supplements necessarily. One of them is curcumin, which is found in turmeric. And it's quite a dirty substance, by which I mean that it acts via many different pathways. And it seems to have numerous different health effects, depending on things like the dose and the source. And there's actually been a lot of research on curcumin over time, to the point where there are meta-analyses on many different outcomes. And one of these, of course, is arthritis, because it seems to have some anti-inflammatory effects that can improve arthritic symptoms. But there are all sorts of other outcomes that have been looked at related to things like cardiometabolic health, condition, skin conditions such as psoriasis. And I won't go into the mechanisms by which it's thought to act or anything like that, but I'll instead just mention some of the forms of curcumin that have been tested. Some of them are really expensive. So one of the better studied sources, for instance, is called Curcumin. And it's basic curcumin that's been dispersed with these colloidal nanoparticles, which improve the bioavailability dramatically. And as a result of that, the recommended dose of that product is only 90 milligrams a couple of times a day. And that's been studied in particular for its effects on the brain. And it seems to be helpful for supporting memory and some other cognitive functions too. Another of the better tested ones is called Meriva, Meriva. And that's a lecithin formulation of curcumin. And that also seems to improve curcumin absorption. I mentioned absorption because by itself, the bioavailability of curcumin is very low. But rather than going for those really expensive options, because they are expensive, certainly on a per gram basis, I think a lot of people, they can just combine curcumin with black pepper, because black pepper contains something called piperine, which dramatically improves the absorption of curcumin. And so rather than supplementing with it, I think you can probably just use it in your cooking on a semi-regular basis and get a bunch of the benefits that it has to offer. And just make sure that you take it in a meal that also has black pepper in it and contains some fat too, because fat seems to aid the absorption as well. And if you have joint pain, you're using it for that particular reason, you could do that on a more or less daily basis. So one of the things I used to do, for example, not for joint health specifically, but was to combine black pepper, turmeric, and ginger, just with some extra virgin olive oil, and mix those together and have that with various different dishes. So you can just add that to, say, a bunch of different beans, like kidney beans, whatever it might be. It's actually really tasty, and you can have a lump of meat with that, and you've got a nice meal. It's not gourmet cuisine, but the reason that it might make sense to combine those things I just mentioned with ginger is just that there is some really interesting evidence that ginger can help with joint pain. And ginger is also dirty like curcumin. And that's in part because it's broadly from the same family, but it's been shown to help with everything from digestion to many different aspects of cardiometabolic health. It's one of the few supplements that I think actually probably does meaningfully, consistently reduce body weight and fat mass. The effect size isn't substantial, but let's say that you're currently on a cut. You can add ginger to either to meat, or you can add powdered ginger to hot water and have it as a kind of ginger tea. And that might well slightly accelerate your fat loss. And it probably acts through some mechanisms that are shared with supplements such as capsaicinoids or capsinoids, which are the compounds that are found in chili peppers that act via TRPV1 channels to stimulate thermogenesis in people who have intact brown adipose tissue. So that combination of ginger, black pepper, turmeric with a fat-containing meal, I think is a really easy win. And it actually tastes pretty good too, at least to me. Might just be me. But of the other supplements that are out there for joint tissues, I'm not too convinced by the strength of the evidence for any of them. The ones that are interesting, though, are, to me, interesting for slightly different reasons. It's not specifically for their effects on joints, but instead it's because there's some preliminary evidence suggesting that things like glucosamine, chondroitin might actually be quite good anti-aging supplements. And that might be in part because they support what's called the glycocalyx, which is this slippery layer that coats certain tissues such as blood vessels, and therefore seems to be particularly important to cardiovascular health and avoiding cardiovascular disease in the long run. And so by supporting the production of that glycocalyx, it could be that supplements are helping with that, even if any effects they have on joint health might be quite small. So you could consider taking a glucosamine chondroitin supplement too, but I would probably just start with that combination I just mentioned because it's inexpensive. You can get those spices from pretty much anywhere, and you can combine in ways that taste pretty good as well.
Awesome. Yeah. You talked about initially, like obviously the more restrictive you are with like food intake and again, omitting certain foods, like you're going to be at a higher risk of these health supplements that you'll want to potentially look at. And a couple you hit on were like B12, zinc, and the one we talked about last episode too. So in this situation, would you have it be like, is a multivitamin where it has many different vitamins in it? Is that something that you think people can supplement here with this? Or do you think it needs to be more like, hey, you need to look at the individual micronutrients like B12 specific, or do you think something like a multivitamin can help fill in the gaps here with this?
It's an interesting question. And what I would say is that my guess is that at a population level, were you to give a blanket recommendation, or were you to give multivitamin, multi-mineral supplement that was relatively well balanced, maybe there was a different one for men versus women, they would probably both marginally improve overall health. So I think as a generic recommendation, it's not a bad thing to do. It's when I think it's going to more beneficial the worse your existing diet is. But my guess is that many people listening to this probably eat quite well. They probably consume quite a wide variety of different fruits and vegetables. They consume plenty of protein-rich foods. They don't consume either way too much or way too little. They distribute their food intake appropriately and so on. And for those people, I just think that you can be a bit more targeted. So for someone like you, Jeff, I'm guessing you eat really well. And maybe for you, if you consume an omnivorous diet that's relatively well balanced, it makes for you to supplement magnesium citrate, vitamin D during the winter. And then apart from that, you don't really need to worry about anything. And that's my approach too. I don't necessarily supplement vitamin D, but I might take magnesium occasionally because that's probably the one thing that I'm semi-concerned about. But I get my work done and there's nothing really that jumps out related to nutrient insufficiencies. So I think you just have to take it on a per person basis. But for the most part, if you do take a multivitamin, multi-mineral, if you consume too much of certain micronutrients, in many instances, certainly the water-soluble ones, you're just going to pee them out anyway. Right. All you're really doing is potentially losing a bit of money. You're probably not really hurting yourself. There are some products on the market, though, that do contain a bunch of things other than vitamins and minerals, and some of them are actually quite potent. I do think that the source matters, the particular products that you take matters, because if the product contains things like milk thistle and various other herbs, spices, some of them are dosed such that they could actually have meaningful health effects, and that could go either way depending on the person. So I don't know how helpful that is as an answer, but my guess is that a lot of people listening to this probably wouldn't need to take a multi, but if they were traveling, say, and they don't know what they're going to be consuming, then it might be a good option.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. Like you said, people that watch what they eat, they have a pretty solid diet overall. It's like the need for the multivitamins goes down. And it got me thinking in terms of how I do it. Like with the multivitamins, I'm not like right now I'm trying to gain some, I'm in a small surplus. And so it's from the need for these vitamins probably goes down big. Like I don't need to take a multivitamin during this time. But when I'm like cutting or something like that, I might take like half the dosage of it or something like that, just to, again, just bridge a gap and just make sure that I'm not missing out on anything crazy with that. And then the other application that I like too is if maybe you're traveling, or if I know that maybe my diet quality's kind of gone down the last couple of days or something like that, that's also a great time to potentially just use the multivitamin approach versus,
Yeah. One thing I'll add is in the context of energy balance, so gaining versus the mass, I do think that when people are cutting, it makes sense to prioritize satiating foods, which tend to be quite rich in fiber, high in water, but also rich in vitamins and minerals. So I'm thinking, for instance, of fruits and vegetables. Not all of them, say Sharon fruit is incredibly high in sugar and energy dense. Coke and avocado quite high in fat. And that's not to say that they are inherently fattening or they're not very satiating. I'm just saying that in the context of an energy deficit, you have to be more particular about consuming those items. But given that people, I think, should be prioritizing those types of foods, even though they're consuming fewer calories, I don't think that there's any need for micronutrient status to get any worse. And also, as people fat, the protein needs probably aren't changing that much. Relative to body weight, they probably do change a little bit. So relative to body weight, they should probably be slightly higher than when they're trying to gain mass. mass. So whereas, let's say you're trying to gain mass and your protein intake is at 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram per day, while you're trying to lose fat mass, maybe at 2 to 2.4. So given that, and given that many of those protein-rich foods are very high in certain micronutrients, so take the example of meat being very high in things like zinc and iron, there's just no need for micronutrient status to change any availability changes. And instead, actually, if you're trying to gain mass, I think, especially if you struggle with not having much of an appetite, a lot of those sources that are going to help you gain mass are actually vehicles for calories. They're not particularly nutrient dense. I'm thinking of things like white rice, if your glycemic control is quite good. And then otherwise, they might be things that are actually really good for you, but they don't contain vast quantities of things that are technically essential. So take the example of extra virgin olive oil. It's Bulka's best friend, and it's very good for cardiovascular health, but many of its health benefits are affected by its polyphenol content, not by the fact that it contains loads of vitamin E or anything like that.
No, that's a good point you bring up. Because like when you do start to cut your lower calories, you are probably going to improve your overall diet quality, and there's going to end up being a lot more vitamins and minerals in your diet. So that's a good point you bring up. And so almost it's, hey, you might want to actually, the food sources you're having in your massing phases, you might want to double check that because you're going to be getting potential less vitamins and minerals. So no, that's a good point you bring up there on that. And then lastly, with the multivitamin too, the other downside from what it sounds like too is, again, what they actually put in there, you don't really have much control over, and you're at the mercy of that. And for example, if they have like magnesium in there, it could be oxide or something like that they're putting in there. So you don't really have much control over like the sources of the vitamins either. Cool. Real quick. Cool. So yeah, I think we hit the health supplements pretty good there. There's, like you said, there's endless amounts, and we could probably go on and on with those. Let's move on to the muscle building side of things here, performance supplements. So what are some like big ones there that I guess we could take it from the route of that are under high? And yeah, if there's any off the top of your head there with that, and we can start with that.
So last episode we spoke about Ashby, didn't we?
Yes.
Did we speak about creatine?
We did not.
Okay. So creatine is the grandfather of them, and it's deserved that accolade. And I won't go into any detail there because I think most people are so familiar with it. But suffice it to say that it can help with your muscle building efforts. And whether you are trying to gain fat-free mass or lose fat mass, you probably should be taking creatine. I also don't think that if you are looking to step on stage in a physique competition, you necessarily need to cycle off it unless you strongly think that it somehow affects your appearance and it makes you look watery, in inverted commas. Instead of dose, to be honest, I still don't think the data are that clear regarding what dose is best because different studies will administer it in quite different ways. So for example, there's a question relates to whether you creatine load or not. And loading is just the process consume a large daily quantity, typically divided into 3 or 4 doses for 5 to 7 days. So you might, for example, take 5 grams per dose 4 times a day for 5 days. So 20 grams per day for 5 days. And then after that, move to a maintenance dose, which might be, say, 3 to 5 grams. That's a traditional creatine supplementation protocol. And you can do that. And by loading creatine in that way, you probably will push up your creatine stores to a point at which they're saturated in your skeletal muscles faster than if you just took that maintenance dose every day. But if you do the maintenance dose every day, then you probably will eventually reach the same amount. It will just take you longer to get there. So if you are just trying to gain at the fastest rate possible, then maybe you want to creatine load. But otherwise, for most people, you could probably just take it day in, day out. And you could probably take it year round too. There are responders and non-responders, which is probably true of every supplement. But in the case of creatine, we actually know quite a lot about that and why that's the case. And it just has to do with the fact that a lot of people already consume quite a lot of creatine from their diet. So if you consume even say 100 grams of sardines a day and 100 grams of steak a day and 100 grams of trout a day, you're getting over 5 grams of creatine from that. And so taking an additional 3 grams, if you're doing that day in, day out, it's probably not really going to make any difference whatsoever. Whereas if you're a vegan and you're consuming 1 gram per day, those 3 grams you're taking by way of supplementation definitely will have an effect. It could also be that doing high volumes of training could deplete your creatine stores more, and you're therefore more likely to benefit from creatine supplementation. Whether the dose that you take should scale to body weight isn't that clear. Intuitively, it makes sense that is a good way to go. And the dose that I've sometimes recommended is basically equivalent to about 5 to 7 grams for someone who weighs 100 kilos. So 0.5 to 0.7 grams per 10 kilos of your weight. You could start with that. And I don't think that would be a bad way to go. And I think that will certainly saturate your phosphocreatine stores. But whether that's better than just taking 3 grams a day, I don't know. I just suspect that for someone who's 90 kilos and training hard 5 days a week and consuming a modest amount of dietary protein, they might benefit from that slightly higher amount of creatine supplementation. And then in terms of when to take it and what to take it with, if you take it with carbohydrate and or protein, you probably slightly improve the uptake of the creatine. And so for that reason, I would just say have it with food. And that is probably as much as most people need to know. And then in terms of the specific creatine product, a lot of people will recommend CreaPure, which is just this micronized form of creatine that's made by a German company, memory serves. Whether that's actually better than a lot of the creatine on the market, I don't know, or pure. One of the things that I've worked on previously is I used to formulate supplements for a company, and it was interesting when we were sourcing ingredients because I basically discovered that the alternative creatine, which comes in different mesh sizes, so some of it's fluffier than other creatine, was basically at least as pure as the CreaPure stuff, also happened to be twice as expensive. So personally, when I take creatine, I no longer bother getting CreaPure necessarily. I think regular creatine monohydrate, it's not CreaPure, that's sourced from a manufacturer that you trust, is probably absolutely fine. So that's creatine. And I think in terms of gains that you can get from a supplement, it's probably still the pick of the bunch. To my knowledge, there haven't been any head-to-head studies comparing to something like ashwagandha, which, going by recent research, might be next in line. I don't know. I think those 2 small-scale studies that have been done so far on the combination of ashwagandha and resistance training suggest that it could have significant effects, but whether it does, I really don't know. And then in terms of other performance-enhancing supplements, there are a few that are interesting. I'm not particularly quick to recommend. So I'm thinking of things like beta-alanine. I do think that beta-alanine can enhance performance, and it acts via different ways from creatine, of course. So creatine is mostly acting by boosting phosphocreatine stores, which are these energy stores that are used during short-term, intermittent, high-intensity exercise. It's aiding the recycling of those stores. And it's also directly stimulating some anabolic pathways in skeletal muscle, whereas beta-alanine is acting by basically being combined with histidine to form carnosine, which then acts as a buffer, and your beta-alanine intake is rate limiting the amount of carnosine in your skeletal muscles. And by acting as a buffer, you offset the accumulation of hydrogen ions in your muscles during strenuous anaerobic exercise, which in turn could help delay fatigue. So if, for example, you were doing lots of work sets that were over 30 seconds long, then there are reasons to think that by taking beta-alanine, you might slightly increase your training volume. And then the rationale is that if you're doing more training volume, then maybe that's a stronger stimulus for subsequent growth, and possibly those effects could accumulate over time. So beta does slightly enhance performance in high intensity exercise lasting anywhere from about 30 seconds to 10 minutes. Where it dramatically affects muscle growth in response to resistance training, I don't know. I'm not particularly inclined to think that. I think if you're an athlete and your sport is characterized by efforts of roughly that duration, then it's a great thing to take. But if you're just a recreational bodybuilder, then I personally would probably save my money. The other ones would include caffeine, of course. It almost feels like you don't have to mention caffeine. But for strength athletes, it's not that far behind something like creatine. It's just different. Creatine is going to help with adaptations to training, whereas caffeine is probably just going to help acutely. And it's going to help most if your recent sleep history leaves a lot to be desired. So if you've been through several nights of insufficient sleep, or if you were completely deprived of sleep last night, caffeine can definitely help in that context. Even if you have been sleeping well, it probably can help. How it affects resistance training is slightly nuanced. If you look at different types of exercise, and caffeine probably has the strongest effects on endurance. So it'd be of most interest to someone like an Ironman triathlete, say, or a marathon runner. With respect to resistance training, though, it's probably most impactful for how quickly during exercises as opposed to maximal strength. So if you're doing a power-based exercise and trying to move the bar as fast as possible, for example, during a squat, then caffeine will likely help with that. It also helps with cognition during exercise. So if that's relevant to you, let's say that you're playing basketball and you need to be able to process lots of information in an unpredictable environment as quickly as possible, I think caffeine is a great candidate in that context. So I would say on a regular basis, day in, day out, taking something like 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight 1 hour before exercise, provided that dose comes no later than maybe 8 hours before sleep, is reasonable. And that provision is important, because if you consume too much caffeine too late in the day, you can not only reduce the depth of your sleep, you can also delay your body's clock, going by some interesting research by Ken Wright and his colleagues. So how does that look? It's probably something like 4 instant coffees for a lot of people, or 1 store-bought coffee, like an Americano, or a filter coffee, plus 1 instant coffee. It's in that territory. In terms of caffeine dose and timing, it really depends on you as a person. There's huge variation between people and how they metabolize caffeine, depending on things like their genetic function of their liver and so on, but also their tolerance. And there was a meta-analysis that came out recently looking at the effects of caffeine on sleep, basically saying if you stop consuming caffeine by this time, then the maximal dose that you should take is this. If you stop consuming it by this time, the maximal dose is this. Actually, there's literally one study that is worth reading on that subject in terms of its relevance to lots of people. And that's a study that was done that looked at healthy people who are regular caffeine consumers, and it actually gave them quite a large dose of caffeine. They took 150 milligrams of caffeine 3 times a day, and the final dose was halfway through the waking day, more or less. So we're talking about 450 milligrams of caffeine a day, which for most people is probably something like 6 times their body weight. So 6 milligrams per kilo of body weight, which is a lot of caffeine. And at the end of the 10-day period in which they that amount of caffeine in each day, their sleep was basically exactly the same as a baseline. And it's because you have regulatory mechanisms that are in place that try and protect your sleep. And you also build tolerance to caffeine. So if you are a caffeine fiend and you really like coffee, I think provided that you don't consume a lot more than you usually do, you don't consume it much later than you usually do, you don't really need to worry about it too much. And things like coffee are good for many other aspects of health too. It seems to be good for body composition. It's particularly good for liver health. And that's because coffee probably contains over 1,000 different chemicals, which have distinct health promoting effects. So I think caffeine is up there too. It's just not something that most people need to think about, frankly. And then otherwise, I suppose some of the more popular ones include things like citrulline malate, but I'm not really impressed by any of the research on that. I don't think that it's worth taking for most people who are tuning into this. Some of them that have been studied that probably are slightly beneficial are just things that you can get from your diet anyway. So I'm thinking, for example, of nitrate supplementation, which is often taken in the form of beetroot juice, typically at a dose of something like 300 to 600 milligrams per day. It's often expressed as millimoles, which can be quite confusing. And that dose is often taken about 3 hours before exercise, because it takes a while for the process converting nitrate into nitrite and then using that to increase nitric oxide synthesis, which in turn leads to many of the effects of nitrate supplementation. It can be helpful in different forms of exercise. And a lot of that work focused on endurance exercise, but there's a bit of work looking at power as well. And in short, nitrate supplementation seems to actually enhance the function of type 2 muscle fibers, which are the most powerful, fastest contracting, fastest fatiguing muscle fibers that also have the most growth potential. So I think just consuming a nitrate-rich diet is a good way to go, but you could tinker with beetroot supplementation. It might be particularly helpful if, say, you have high blood pressure, because it's also clear that by increasing nitric oxide synthesis and in turn vasodilatation, nitrate supplementation can reduce blood pressure. So it's an instance of people thinking through a supplement in the context of all the different things that they should consider with respect to their health. And then there are some other interesting ones too. So things like there's a New Zealand black currant juice. It's called Currans. I don't know if you've come across that before. Again, a lot of the work on endurance athletes and on strength endurance. I won't go into it, but it clearly has positive effects on that type of exercise. I don't think the effects are necessarily there for strength to power athletes, though. So it's probably not worth going into. The others include Rola rosea, which of course has got quite a lot of airtime recently. And again, I think that it definitely is having some ergogenic effects in specific context. The quality of the research on resistance training specifically so far has been quite low. And if you look at the individual studies, the doses that they've used are all over the place. So for example, many of the initial studies looked at a particular type of rhodiola. It's called SHR5. And the dose that was used in those studies, roughly in the 300, 700 milligram per day range. But then recently, there was this study that combined rhodiola with caffeine, and the dose of rhodiola that they used was 2.4 grams. So we're talking about 4 times the upper end of the range that was used previously. And some of these studies also don't report the particular extract used, and that's relevant because in the case of rhodiola, it seems like the resins and the sides are probably particularly important to its ergogenic effects and general effects on health. So it seems to help with things like mood, potentially. So rhodiola is interesting. I just think that the jury is out right now. And then otherwise, I think that's probably largely it in the case of potentially performance enhancing supplements. I know there are many others that are out there, but that's probably the short list that I would include for people who are listening to this. And suffice it to say that I think that all of those can actually be helpful in specific contexts. But if you were just looking to grow muscle tissue slightly faster or preserve it while you're losing fat, I would just say take your creatine, about 5 grams a day with breakfast. And if you consume caffeine, then carry on as you are.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I've seen so far with the performance and muscle building side of things. There's really not much out there. Like you said, creatine's going to be the one that's been studied the most and probably your safest bet there. Other than that, like you said, it's really individual, right? So like beta alanine, for example, is one that I feel like has gotten a lot of hype around it. But like you said, that's only going to be helpful in like specific situations. Like you said, 30 seconds to 10 minutes there. So if that doesn't apply to you, that might not be your greatest choice there. And then like you said, caffeine's just a solid one. But like you said, people just overlook that one just because caffeine, that's just something that people take all the time. Cool. Yeah. No, what about, and when I ask this, I know that these supplements are probably going to have all these things in it, but one thing that people will always ask me about are like, oh, should I take a pre-workout? So if you maybe want to hit on that and the pros and cons of a pre-workout and your thoughts on those.
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at any of the pre-workout products. It's probably been about 3 years or so, but historically, they tended to contain proprietary blends, which is something that we discussed last time. And near the top of the list of ingredients was caffeine. And that was often combined with some niacin for a bit of a skin flash, tingling sensation. And then maybe they contain creatine as well. In that instance, the creatine and the caffeine are doing the heavy lifting. As an aside, there's some interesting work looking at combining creatine and caffeine, suggesting that in some ways they might antagonize each other. In some ways, though, I suspect that they might have some complementary effect. When I say antagonize, what I mean is that by combining them, you might actually get smaller benefits from each of them individually. But again, there just isn't that much research looking at that. And also some of the outcomes they've looked at, so things like muscle half relaxation time, aren't particularly relevant to most people. So I just wouldn't worry too much about that stuff. So going back to pre-workout supplements, if the pre-workout product contains known doses of ingredients, so it lists everything that it contains as well as their quantities, and the quantity jive what we've been discussing today, let's say that it contains beta-alanine, creatine, caffeine, and then a few other things, which frankly are probably pretty much fillers, then I think that can be fine depending on when it's taken. And the most egregious thing about the pre-workouts historically is they contained heroic dose of caffeine. And so let's say that you train after work and you can only get to the gym at 6 p.m. You wouldn't want to drink one of those products an hour before heading to the gym. And then you're going to try and sleep 6 hours later and you're going to be wide awake because you've just consumed 300 milligrams of caffeine on top of the 300 milligrams of caffeine that you had at the start of the day. So I generally nudge people towards pre-workouts that don't contain caffeine, depending on the time of day at which they train. And you can try these products, but frankly, it tends to be cheaper to actually just buy the individual ingredients that you need and then take those. And that way, you know exactly what you're taking. You can tinker with doses, let's say, as your knowledge progresses, as you come on new information, and you save yourself a bit of money down the line. And you can also better determine how you respond to the individual ingredients too, because you might take a multi-ingredient product and the net effect is positive, but you also have certain symptoms as a response in response to taking it that you don't want. And you might not be able to put your finger on what's causing those symptoms. I think often they're quite easy to explain. So take the example of someone feeling jittery after taking a pre-workout, and it's because of the caffeine content. But sometimes people might have other symptoms that are harder to pass. So you can take them if you like. There are probably some okay ones that are out there. For the most part, though, I would just say take the individual ingredients and stick to creatine and caffeine. If someone knows of a pre-workout product that seems to genuinely be a step up from what's come previously, then do get in touch because I'd love to see it. But even the better ones that I've seen, they tend to just be creatine and caffeine most of the heavy lift, and then maybe a bit of alanine, some citrulline, malate, or whatever it might be. But those other things we just don't know that much about. And the other thing to note is the more ingredients there are in a supplement, the less we know about how they interact. There are so few supplements that have been studied in combination. Some have, so things like caffeine and L-theanine, or curcumin and piperine, but most of them haven't. And actually, when you combine them, the effects that you get aren't what you anticipate. People often assume that there'll be additive effects, and in some cases, they cancel each other out. So I tend to nudge people towards products that don't contain lots of ingredients and instead are very well considered in terms of how the ingredients are combined. And if there haven't been studies on the ingredients that are being used in combination, then there needs to at least be a strong biological rationale for why they're likely to have additive or synergistic effects.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of these pre-workout supplements now are maybe hitting a little bit more on like the cognitive side of things. And so it seems like that's where some of the like folk and stuff like that. And that's probably a topic that we can dive into specifically there on that. So it seems like they're getting a little bit more around that, because I agree, all the older pre-workouts, I feel like you said, were heavily dosed by like caffeine was really the biggest thing. So it's like you can get that through other sources. Well, the marketing on it's pretty smart if you think about it, right? Add in a pre-workout, it gets people in that like routine that it becomes a habit, right? It tastes good. And so like I think a lot of it's the marketing aspect that they can get you on with the pre-workout supplement. And again, it becoming like a habit to take that before you work out.
Yeah, maybe there's some conditioning there. People take their pre-workout and they associate that with feeling a certain way and they get fired up for the gym. And maybe it's an instance in which the placebo effects are stronger than they might otherwise be.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not something that's been studied to my knowledge, but it's an interesting hypothesis. But yeah, I would just say it's not sexy, but stick to the stuff that works and that we know works, and don't bother with these expensive multi-ingredient products that might not be doing what you think they're doing.
One thing I wanted to hit on that you brought up too is people will commonly take this like after work or like late at night, right? They'll take that pre-workout. My very first time in a pre-workout, I was 18 years old, and one of my buddies worked at a supplement store around here. And do you remember Jack's 3D, that supplement? Yeah. That was the first one I took. I took it at 9 o'clock at night. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, all right, I got to do some push-ups or something, man. It was freaking great. Worst night of sleep. And I was like, what the hell did I just take? But I also know that Jack 3D was also there's a lot of interesting thoughts around that pre-workout supplement. So
yeah, so I'm just racking my brain now about some of the better supplement stories that are out there. Obviously, there were products, talking about the early 2000s, that had to be pulled from the market because people took them and they ended up dying. And supplement contamination used to be a much bigger issue than it is now. But I think if you grew up lifting weights and you're a teenager and you didn't really know what you're doing, you're bound to have a few good supplement stuff. And I don't have any particularly good ones, but I can think about some of the absolute nonsense that I've taken over time, as well as how people responded to finding out that I had supplements. Like I went to a boarding school, God forbid. And I remember someone finding in my drawer the supplements that I had, and I had powdered caffeine, I had powdered creatine, I had powdered glutamine, I had a pure glucose product. So after workouts, I would neck like this cheap whey protein with 100 grams of pure glucose, which is basically like a perfect recipe for diabetes. And this would be like 9 o'clock at night because that was the only time I could exercise. And I remember doing that once. And then I also obviously needed to eat after because I had to maximize the post-exercise anabolic window. And so I think about an hour after that, I'd have a can of tuna and I was trying to gain weight. So I'd add like loads of olive oil to it. And I remember one day just not being able to keep it down and throwing up in response to that, but then feeling like I'd lost those nutrients and then just necking one of my diabetes shakes. So there was that. But when the teacher found my supplement stash, they were really concerned about the creatine, because they were like, oh, we think that this is like anabolic steroid and we need to be concerned about this. But they realized that I didn't have weighing scales. I had pure caffeine powder. And if I'd taken 3 grams of that caffeine powder, not knowing what I was doing, that's pretty dangerous. Like you're asking for some serious cardiovascular issues. And so I do think it's important to check what kids are taking, but it's just an instance in which it's so often that people respond in a worried way when the worry is completely misdirected and really they're missing something that's right in front of their eyes, which could actually be a real problem.
Yeah, no, that's hilarious. Yeah, at that age, when you get supplements, it doesn't even matter if you're throwing up, you're still going to take it. You got to get those gains at all costs. And now looking back on it, I'm sure it's, man, was I wrong? But we live and learn. So So I love good supplement stories. Like you said, I think everybody, at least one of them, if they were taking supplements at a younger age. Greg, as always, a ton of great information in here. Again, we'll probably do another episode on supplements. Again, we knew this was going to take multiple episodes to do. But before I let you go, is there any, you obviously went over some things at the beginning where people, some things you're working on. Is there anywhere else where you'd like the audience to, or anything like that coming up on your end?
Yeah, just at Greg Potter PhD on Instagram. And then when the podcast does come out, I'll also post the podcast videos on YouTube and the YouTube channel at Greg Potter PhD.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to the, yep. Thank you for coming on, Greg, and we will talk to you next time.
Thanks, Jeff.